All right, people, let's talk trade, global politics, and everyone's favorite country at the southern tip of Africa. South Africa's facing some interesting times. The trade winds are shifting and not necessarily in a good way. We're talking potential US sanctions and the AGOA rug being pulled out from under their feet. But hey, this isn't the time for doom and gloom. South Africa's got options, people. In response to potential US sanctions and the termination of AGOA benefits, South Africa can adopt a multifaceted trade strategy to mitigate economic impacts. All right, first up, let's talk about keeping it in the family, because blood is thicker than water, or in this case, trade is thicker than, well, you get the idea. South Africa's got a whole continent at its doorstep, and it's time to start seeing those borders as bridges, not barriers. Enter the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, for those who like their acronyms short and snappy. Think of it like the African Union decided to throw a giant trade party and everyone's invited. Now, this isn't just some feel-good initiative, folks. We're talking about the potential to create the largest free trade area in the world based on the number of participating countries. Imagine the possibilities. South Africa, with its relatively developed manufacturing sector, could become a powerhouse, supplying goods and services to its African neighbors. We're talking everything from cars and machinery to financial services and tourism. But hold on, before we get too carried away with dreams of Pan-African prosperity, let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say the rhino in the savannah. Tariff barriers. Those pesky little taxes on imported goods can really put a damper on trade. That's why South Africa needs to be at the forefront of advocating for tariff reductions within AfCFTA. It's time to break down those walls, metaphorically speaking, of course, and let the goods flow freely. And while we're at it, let's not forget about those other trade-hindering hurdles, customs procedures. Streamlining these processes is crucial. Okay, let's move on from family matters to the cool kids table, the BRICS nations. We're talking Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of course South Africa. It's like the Avengers of the developing world, each with their own unique superpowers. Now, I know what you're thinking, Trevor. You can't just lump all these countries together. They're all so different. And you're right, they are different. But here's the thing, despite their differences, the BRICS nations share a common goal: to challenge the dominance of the West in global affairs. And when it comes to trade, they're all about finding ways to cooperate and support each other. For South Africa, this means two words: China and India. These two economic giants are like the cool older siblings South Africa never had. Always down to hang out and, more importantly, do business. Let's start with China, the economic powerhouse of the group. They're hungry for raw materials to fuel their massive manufacturing industry, and guess what South Africa's got in abundance? Minerals, baby. But it's not just about raw materials. China's also a huge market for South African agricultural products, like wine, citrus fruits, and nuts. Now, let's hop over to India, the land of spices, Bollywood, and a rapidly growing middle class. India's got a massive appetite for consumer goods, and South Africa's in a prime position to satisfy those cravings. We're talking everything from cars and appliances to clothing and cosmetics. All right, let's take a break from the emerging markets for a moment and hop across the Mediterranean to good old Europe. Now, I know what you're thinking. Trevor, Europe? They're practically on life support over there. What can they possibly offer South Africa? And you know what? You're not entirely wrong. Europe's been going through some things lately: economic stagnation, political turmoil, you name it. But here's the thing, Europe's still a major economic powerhouse, and they've got a long-standing relationship with South Africa. In fact, the European Union is South Africa's largest trading partner outside of Africa. So there's definitely potential to expand that relationship, even if it means navigating a few bureaucratic hurdles along the way. One of the biggest opportunities for South Africa lies in the Economic Partnership Agreement, or EPA, between the EU and the Southern African Development Community, SADC. This agreement aims to create a free trade area between the two regions, eliminating tariffs and other barriers to trade. Sounds great, right? Well, it is, in theory. The problem is these agreements are notoriously complex, with more clauses and sub-clauses than you can shake a stick at. And of course, there are always winners and losers in any trade deal. South Africa needs to make sure it's negotiating from a position of strength, ensuring that its interests are protected. The bottom line is this: Europe offers a massive market for South African goods, particularly agricultural products like wine, fruits and nuts. And let's not forget about tourism. Europeans love a good safari, and South Africa's got plenty of lions, elephants and giraffes to go around. South Africa needs to work closely with the EU to address these barriers. This means harmonizing standards, streamlining regulations and making it easier for businesses to comply with the rules. All right, let's shift gears again and head over to the Arabian Peninsula, where the desert meets the sea and the oil flows like, well, oil. We're talking about the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, a political and economic alliance made up of 6 countries: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman and Bahrain. Now, you might be thinking, Trevor, what does South Africa have in common with a bunch of oil-rich desert kingdoms? And it's true, at first glance they might seem like an odd couple, but dig a little deeper and you'll find that there's more to this relationship than meets the eye. For starters, the GCC countries are crazy rich, like seriously wealthy, and they are always on the lookout for investment opportunities. South Africa, with its stable political system, relatively developed infrastructure and abundance of natural resources, could be a very attractive destination for GCC investors. But it's not just about attracting investment. The GCC countries are also major importers of food and other goods. And guess what South Africa's got in abundance? Agricultural products. We're talking fruits, vegetables, meat, you name it. The GCC could be a lucrative market for South African farmers and food producers. Now let's talk about infrastructure. The GCC countries have been investing heavily in infrastructure projects, from ports and airports to roads and railways. South African companies, with their expertise in construction, engineering and project management, could be major players in this sector. One way to do this is by pursuing free trade agreements with the GCC countries. This would eliminate tariffs and other barriers to trade, making it easier for South African businesses to export their goods and services. Okay, folks, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the plains of Africa to the bustling cities of Asia and the shimmering deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. We've talked about the importance of strengthening intra-African trade, deepening ties with the BRICS nations, rekindling the flame with Europe, and exploring the potential of the GCC. But here's the thing about trade. It's not enough to just identify potential partners and opportunities. You also need to know how to navigate the complex web of rules, regulations and trade policies that govern international commerce. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a unicycle. It takes skill, strategy and a whole lot of patience. So, let's break it down, shall we? We'll start with China, the economic behemoth of the East. China's trade policies can be a bit of a mystery, shrouded in bureaucracy and often subject to change. South African businesses need to be aware of China's import tariffs, product standards and labeling requirements. They also need to understand the Chinese business culture, which places a strong emphasis on relationships and guanxi, or connections. Next up, we have India, the land of spices, Bollywood and 1 billion potential customers. India's trade policies are notoriously complex, with a labyrinthine system of tariffs, taxes and regulations. South African businesses need to be prepared to navigate this bureaucracy, and they should consider partnering with local companies who can help them navigate the Indian market. Moving on to the European Union, the land of baguettes, bureaucracy and a single market of over 440 million consumers. The EU has a reputation for having some of the strictest product standards in the world, so South African businesses need to make sure their goods meet those standards. So there you have it, folks. South Africa's trade strategy in a nutshell, or should I say a protea flower. It's a delicate balancing act, juggling existing partnerships while exploring new horizons. But hey, if anyone can pull it off, it's South Africa. They've got the resilience, the resources, and let's be honest, they've dealt with far worse than a few trade barriers. Remember, it's all about strategically aligning themselves with partners who appreciate what they bring to the table. Think of it like a delicious South African braai. You need the perfect blend of spices, the right cut of meat, and of course the warm company of friends to make it a truly unforgettable experience. By strategically aligning with trade partners whose policies accommodate South African exports, and by proactively addressing potential trade barriers, South Africa can mitigate the adverse effects of US sanctions and AGOA termination. This approach requires a combination of policy reforms, targeted negotiations, and robust engagement with both existing and new trade partners. By proactively addressing potential obstacles, diversifying their export basket, and maybe even teaching the world a thing or two about the joys of biltong and amarula, South Africa, can not only mitigate the risks of sanctions and AGOA termination, but they can actually emerge stronger and more prosperous than ever before. And that, my friends, is something worth raising a glass of South African wine too. Cheers to that.